Accusing Biden and the United States of starting the war in Ukraine was initially the prerogative of the Kremlin and its allies. It was Moscow that laid all the blame on the Biden administration and said that it was the actions of the United States and Ukraine that caused the war to begin. This justification has long existed in the Russian discourse and is still being used. At the same time, Trump himself began to use a similar narrative during his election campaign, accusing Biden of causing the war. And in this episode, we will discuss whether Biden is to blame for the outbreak of the war and what arguments there are in this regard. Trump's election campaign began with the claim that if he were still president, there would be no war in Ukraine. This narrative has been repeated by Trump himself and his administration. Later, the accusations became more serious and direct. Trump began to blame Biden for the outbreak of the war, saying that he had provoked Putin and promised that Ukraine would join NATO, thus also shifting the responsibility to Biden. In general, constant criticism of Biden has become an important part of any Trump speech, no matter what he is talking about. Even after he won the election and after he became president, Trump continues to criticize Biden, claiming that he is responsible for the war, accusing him of weakening America and of failing to stop the war, and even of giving Ukraine $350 billion in aid for free. According to Trump, the actual figures are many times smaller. Such rhetoric has begun to actively overlap, to a certain extent, with Russian propaganda and even contribute to it. From the first day of the war, the Russian leadership blamed the United States and said that it was the United States that was interested in the war and had made it happen in the first place. The responsibility was also shifted to Ukraine, but still in the context of blaming America, since the Kremlin never considered the Ukrainian leadership to be a subject. Let's move on to the question of whether Biden is to blame for the outbreak of the war and what mistakes the U.S. administration actually made on the way to this war. The question of Ukraine's accession to NATO arose long before Biden and even long before Obama. The issue began to be actively discussed under Republican Bush. The idea first appeared in the days of Kuchma, and Yushchenko tried to take it up more thoroughly but failed. Anyway, in 2008, Ukraine wanted to apply for NATO membership, and the United States supported this initiative. However, other members, such as Germany and France, were not happy about it, and the internal atmosphere in Ukraine was not particularly conducive to it. The population of Ukraine did not share such views, and the opposition, represented by the Party of Regions and the Communist Party, was strongly opposed. In general, it did not work. The discussion continued after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. Ukraine did turn to the alliance, seeking protection from a third party. Integration was quite serious, and the issue of joining NATO was regularly raised. Since then, it has been said that Ukraine could potentially join NATO, but no clear promises have been made. However, the Ukrainian government has even included NATO aspirations in the constitution. Biden himself has also said that the door to NATO is open, but he has not given any precise timeline. Indeed, the issue of joining NATO has long irritated Russia in one form or another. However, the NATO charter itself suggested that any country in the region could apply. Even now, Trump is saying that Ukraine will not join NATO, but he is offering nothing more than verbal assurances at the moment. Perhaps this will be enshrined in future agreements. Another important thesis of Trump is that the war could have been avoided during his term, and that the Democratic administration was extremely weak. It is impossible to verify this claim because Trump did not actually become president for a second consecutive term. It is impossible to analyze. As for Democratic administrations, it is true that Putin's aggression has repeatedly occurred during the rule of Democrats, and probably the Kremlin considers them to be the weakest party and sees them as the weakest party. The annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass began during Obama's administration. Russia's active involvement in Syria also occurred during his second term. By the way, Biden himself was Obama's vice president at the time. The full-scale invasion also took place during the Democratic administration, namely under Biden. It can be assumed that Putin's decision depends on who is in charge of the White House. Continuing the theme of the administration's weakness, the tragedy of Afghanistan played an important role in lowering the prestige of the United States on the world stage and showed the Biden administration to be quite weak. The withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan was discussed even under Trump, and the idea was brewing by itself. At that time, the Americans had been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years, and many considered it unnecessary. With the arrival of Biden, the plans did not change, and the withdrawal of American troops did begin. The main problem was that American intelligence did not foresee the almost immediate fall of the current regime under the Taliban's onslaught. In fact, the local army did not even put up a fight, and American diplomats, some military personnel, and Westerners found themselves in occupied Kabul and were forced to evacuate on an emergency basis. Afghan citizens who have been cooperating with Western countries all this time were also put at risk. Overall, this operation is a complete failure of the Biden administration, which has shaken the prestige of the United States. Russia, seeing this, was once again convinced that the Democratic administration is weak. The next topic is quite important: preventive assistance to Ukraine, which was not actually provided. Western intelligence agencies claimed at the end of 2021 that Russia would invade Ukraine and that there would be a full-scale war. American intelligence knew this, and its predictions were correct. At the same time, Western countries, including the United States, did not actually prepare Ukraine for war and were simply waiting for the occupation. At the last moment, they sent only Stingers and Javelins to fight the 200,000-strong group of Russian troops. Presumably, they believed that these weapons would be used in a guerrilla war. The Biden administration did not believe in Ukraine so much that it was even afraid to supply any heavy weapons to strengthen it. Although, again, the Americans already knew about the war. The situation in Afghanistan also influenced such decisions. American weapons supplied to the Afghan government army were virtually handed over to the Taliban without a fight. The United States was afraid that the same story would happen in Ukraine and that their developments would fall into Russian hands. At the same time, Ukraine's military buildup could have led to completely different results at the beginning of the war, and Russia could have received a much more serious response than it did. This could have turned the entire course of the war, but the Biden administration did not do so. Questions about aid arose repeatedly during the war itself. Biden was in no hurry to provide military support and handed over everything in limited quantities. Therefore, the prolongation of the war can also be attributed to him. The story is similar with preventive measures of a different nature, namely economic, which Zelensky had asked for before the outbreak of a full-scale war. Ever since the Americans began warning Ukraine that Russia was preparing for an attack, the Ukrainian government has been calling for preventive sanctions against the Russian economy to prevent a Russian attack. To what extent this worked is an open question. However, the Russian economy could have been under sanctions for longer than it is now, which would have theoretically caused more damage. In this regard, there is also criticism of Biden, including from Trump, for making half-hearted decisions on Russia. Such accusations also apply to Europe. The point is that the sanctions were still quite mild, as Western countries themselves were forced to rebuild their markets from Russian dependence and did not want to conduct shock therapy for their economies. Therefore, despite the fact that more radical sanctions measures were initially proposed, they eventually came up with milder options for oil, gas, the Navy, and so on. This did not have the desired effect, and Russia itself was also able to reorient itself to Eastern markets during this time. Of course, the sanctions hit Russia in one way or another, but they did not prevent it from continuing the war. And that was the purpose of the sanctions, to cut off the financing of the war. To summarize, Biden cannot be blamed for the start of the war in Ukraine. The invasion was carried out by Russia, and the Kremlin itself has repeatedly changed and invented reasons for it on the fly. At the same time, a number of incompetent or indecisive steps by the Biden administration increased the likelihood of this conflict, and further developments could have gone differently if Biden's decisions had been more serious. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to not miss new videos.
I never answer to no, man, I still go.